What's a family secret you found out as an adult that completely shocked you? Story 1. My uncle essentially had a secret family back in the 60s. He was about to deploy to Vietnam, and my grandma was pretty racist. While on base, he met a nice Mexican lady, and they got married. She got pregnant before he left for Vietnam. During his time away, she couldn't handle the separation and divorced him. Heartbroken, he signed up for another tour of duty. When he finally returned, he found out she had remarried and was raising their child with her new husband. The kid had never known him, and since everyone seemed happy, he quietly walked away and told no one. Then around 2017, when my uncle was in his 70s and on his third, or technically fourth, counting the secret one, marriage, something unexpected happened. His last adult child had moved out, and during a family BBQ, a middle-aged Mexican lady showed up at his door. She said, "Hey, I think you're my dad." My uncle looked at her for a moment and asked, "Maria?" She nodded, confirming, "That's me." He simply said, "Come on out back. The dogs are already on the grill." That was how I met my much older cousin I never knew existed. Her mom and the man who raised her had both passed away a few years earlier. On her deathbed, her mom revealed, "Your dad wasn't actually the man you thought he was." It took my cousin a couple of years to process this and decide to seek out her real father. When she finally found him, her only question was, "Why didn't you ever come around?" My uncle just shrugged and said, "Your mom told me not to, and you had a good family. Why would I ruin that?" Now she lives next door to him. Story 2. I wasn't an adult, more like in 5th grade when I found out. My parents were fighting, and my dad threw this secret at me. My mom's first Sewell experience was rape, and she got pregnant. Somewhere out there, I have an older brother because her parents didn't believe her and sent her to a cider house rules type of place to have the baby. Then my mom retaliated with another revelation. My dad had been married twice before meeting her and had 2 daughters from his first marriage, whom he never saw again. Shocked and overwhelmed, I refused to go to school until I learned more. My mom finally sat me down and told me everything, including all the affairs my dad had and how she caught him, sometimes even with toddler me in tow. Those were some rough times. Story 3. Just a few weeks ago, I found out something surprising about my grandmother. She's white and grew up in California. Back in the early 40s, she was engaged to a Japanese man. When America entered World War II, he was rounded up and deported. She tried to follow him, but her parents prevented her. Eventually, she ended up marrying my racist grandfather and moved to the mountains of West Virginia. Nobody really knows why she made that choice, but it probably had a lot to do with her parents' influence. However, it did shape her values. She was always adamant about teaching my mom and her siblings that racism was wrong. She also supported the civil rights movement, often sending money from her side jobs to organizations that promoted desegregation and diversity. It wasn't exactly a secret, but I think my mom just assumed she had already told us. Story 4. My grandmother cheated on my grandfather while he was deployed in the military. The baby resulting from the affair was given to my grandfather's brother and his wife to adopt since they had fertility issues. This remained a family secret for years until my grandmother decided to reveal it to her son, to nephew at his sister's wedding. My uncle described the close relationship he always had with his cousin, and suddenly it all made sense when he found out they were actually brothers. Despite this revelation, my grandmother never disclosed the identity of his birth father, even when my uncle was dealing with health issues and needed accurate medical history. Tragically, he eventually died of cancer without ever knowing. My uncle shared this story with me during the weekend of my grandfather's funeral. My grandmother had already passed several years earlier, and all my aunts remain in denial about the truth. It turns out my devout Catholic grandmother had a secret love child. Story 5. Turns out a trust fund set up by my grandparents could have fully covered college or trade school expenses for all of us grandkids. However, our parents never told us because using the money for education would have left them with less cash. This was after the fund had already paid for a house for them outright. We only discovered this about a decade after they had emptied it out. Now they wonder why none of us have the resources to help them in their old age, or why we barely talk to them. Maybe if they hadn't sabotaged our educational opportunities and left us to fend for ourselves, they'd have successful doctors, lawyers, and engineers to rely on, instead of a bunch of late bloomers who had to build stability from scratch. Story 6. This isn't exactly a family secret, but it shocked me nonetheless. I recently found out that a local, respectable grocery store owner was a known pedophile. preying on teenage boys. My father had actually suggested that my teenage son apply for a job there because it was close to home and he wouldn't have to drive far. Luckily, my son found a job elsewhere. I learned about the store owner's dark history only after he died. I couldn't believe it at first, so I called my parents. To my disbelief, they both knew about it and still thought it was a good idea for my son to work there. Their reasoning? They believed the store owner wouldn't bother our son because he came from a good middle-class family. Apparently, the man only targeted poor kids who needed the job badly enough to tolerate the abuse. I was beyond furious. It made me sick to think they still considered him a good guy. Story 7. I have a first cousin who was adopted. My family is incredibly close, and cousins are treated like brothers and sisters. Back in the 70s, my aunt got pregnant 2 years before I was born. She already had a daughter, my female cousin. No one really knows who the father was, but we suspect he was a married man she met at work who abandoned her when he found out. She managed to hide the pregnancy right up until the day she gave birth, running to her aunt's house and confessing. It was a boy, and she named him Paul. She had him adopted and wouldn't let the family see him at all. This decision broke my granddad's heart, and after that, no one spoke of it again. In the 1980s, a news article reported the death of a teenager with Paul's name. The family assumed it was him and thought he was dead. Still, nobody talked about it. Then in the late 90s, someone called, trying old addresses to find his birth mom, my aunt. It turned out Paul was very much alive, with a son of his own. My female cousin discovered she had a brother while he was sitting in Granddad's garden, sharing a tense cup of tea. The general reaction from all the cousins was, "What the actual hell?" Nowadays, Paul is a part of every family gathering and group chat. He's a nice guy and has seamlessly become part of the family. Story 8. It wasn't until I was in my late teens that I realized my mom had been a high-functioning alcoholic my entire life. She was always talkative, popular, and incredibly brave, but also deeply lonely and insecure. She coped through numerous romances, drinking, and smoking. Once I made the connection, everything suddenly made sense. From the ages of 7 to 12, I would laugh at her silly requests and help her to bed when she was so tired that she fell asleep on the couch. My brother and I would put ourselves to bed, often leaving lights on because the dark made us uneasy. In the morning, she was always puzzled by the lights being left on. Waking up for school was a nightmare because I was so exhausted from the night before. Sometimes 3 to 4 times a week, neighbors would come over and drink with my mom on the deck for hours while my brother and I played inside. The constant supply of wine bottles in the fridge suddenly made sense too. And I remembered how she would sometimes pick me up from school with a big gulp in the car, warning me not to drink from it. One time I did, and I told her that her tea tasted funny. She looked horrified. It was actually full of white wine. Her friendliness and how she would bring home random people from airports, grocery stores, or wherever who would stick around in our lives for a while and then suddenly vanish also made more sense. Eventually, she married her drinking partner, a violent, abusive man. I'm honestly glad he's dead now. The fights they had, the cruel things he'd say when no one was watching, and the way he drove with an open glass of scotch in the car are burned into my memory. She passed away when I was 15 from breast cancer. She had stopped drinking the year before she died. I believe if she had lived longer, she would have left my stepfather and stayed sober. But who knows? She had been drinking since she was 15, ever since she figured out she could pour liquor into slushies. Story 9. I've been with my wife for 20 years now. Early in our relationship, I caught wind of a family secret on her mom's side, but no one shared the specifics. About a decade later, I finally found out what it was. It turns out that one of my wife's cousins, now a woman in her 50s, doesn't know who her real father is. It wasn't a case of adoption. My wife's aunt, her mom, had an affair back in the day and got pregnant. The family decided it was best to let the cousin believe her father was someone else entirely. Even more surprising, the real father still lives just a few streets away. To this day, her cousin has no idea about her true paternity, and everyone in the family just continues to play along with the story. Story 10. This secret shocked everyone else more than me. After years of being perceived as the model South Asian family, it was revealed that the real reason behind our unconventional upbringing was that everyone was neurodivergent. My parents, refusing to follow harmful generational norms, raised us differently from the start. I found out when I went to university and needed to pass a psychological evaluation for a lab job involving children. The next day, I got an email from the psychiatrist's office asking if I wanted to follow up. After discussing it with my parents and sending them the information, my mom called a family meeting. That's when we all acknowledged that we each had varying neurodivergent conditions. Me with a few, my sister with one, and my grandma with the most. The real drama started when our highly conservative extended family found out. Growing up, we'd heard endless ableist nonsense, especially around neurocognitive conditions, which were seen as shameful or unintelligent. But now our relatives, who had once criticized us, started encouraging their kids to get autism diagnosed, thinking it was some secret to academic success. My parents, who never miss a chance to mess with people, started responding to comparisons between children with lines like, "Oh, that must have been the autism." It's both hilarious and ironic, considering how the same relatives who once condemned neurodivergence are now chasing it, seeing us as the model family, doctor, engineer, and successful kids. The whole situation still makes me laugh, given the years of judgment we endured from them. Story 11. My dad has a brother he's never met. During the Korean War, his dad cheated on his mom and left her for a while. During that time, he had a child with another woman. Eventually, he returned to my grandmother, bringing along his other kids, my dad's brother and sister, and they went on to have 3 more children together, including my dad. So in total, there were 5 kids plus this other uncle. My dad never had any contact with his half-brother. My Nana and Pop-Up met him once when he was an adult, just before my Pop-Up passed away, but my dad knew nothing about it. He only admitted the truth to me because I did DNA testing, and he knew it would eventually come up. My dad wasn't a great father. He walked away from my sister and me when we were just 2 and 3 years old. I always wondered how someone could just leave and not care about their kids. But apparently it's a pattern. His own father did the same. I could never do that. My kids are my everything. They're the reason I breathe. I am nothing like them. Story 12. My family history is honestly wild. During World War II, the Germans invaded our city. My great-grandfather, just a teenager at the time, decided with 2 friends, a guy and a girl, that they were going to kill a Nazi. My great-great-grandmother ran a bed and breakfast, and they lured a Nazi officer inside by promising him a bed while the female friend pretended to be a prostitute. Once they got him into the basement, they knocked him out, killed him, and dumped his body in the river. Later, my great-grandfather married my great-grandmother, but he became a drunken tyrant. One night after he came home drunk, she boiled a pot of water and threw it at him, sending him crashing into the Christmas tree. She then kicked him out into the freezing cold and told him never to come back. They divorced after that. Then there was my grandfather's sister, who had an affair while her husband was away as a truck driver. One day he came home to find everything, his wife, the furniture, everything, gone. A mutual friend called to say her husband had run off with his wife. The usually calm and kind man snapped. After a few days, when the affair ended, he found his ex-wife at her mother's house and stabbed her in the face 11 times. My great-grandmother managed to knock him out with a frying pan. He served 6 months in prison, but after his release, they remarried and lived happily ever after. They even had a parrot. Strangely, despite his attempts, the parrot never repeated his words, only his wife's. And that's just my grandfather's side of my mother's family. My grandmother's side and my father's side have equally wild stories. I could probably write a book. Story 13. My grandpa on my mom's side was a bank robber in the early 1920s, hitting places in South Dakota and Nebraska. Both states wanted to prosecute him, but South Dakota got him first. He was sentenced to around 10 years. Just a few weeks before his release, he attacked the prison warden by smashing a chair over his head, stole the keys, took the warden's car, and drove to his parents' house in Illinois. The police picked him up the next morning. He ended up serving the rest of his sentence plus extra time. I always thought he lost his leg in a war or something. When I asked my dad about it, he bluntly said, he got so tired of messing up that he jumped off a bridge and messed that up too. I later found out the whole story through ancestry records and newspaper archives. Story 14. Both my maternal and paternal grandparents were always the epitome of loving, committed husbands. Growing up, I always admired their relationships and hoped to have something similar. When my maternal grandmother began showing early signs of Alzheimer's, she would get angry at my grandfather, accusing him of seeing that woman again, or questioning where he'd been all night. My mom told me it was likely because he had an affair long ago. Then my dad took an ancestry DNA test and discovered he had a half-brother he never knew about, born from the same father. Dad planned to meet him, but a couple of weeks before they could, his half-brother suffered a fatal heart attack. Both my grandparents have passed, and now there's no one left to ask for details. Story 15. I never knew either of my grandfathers since both passed away before I was born. My dad's mom lived until she was 98, and during the last 2 years of her life, she shared a story with me that left me stunned. One morning, she walked out of the bedroom and saw my grandpa asleep on the couch with another woman. I asked her what she did, and she said she just turned around and went back to her room. I was curious about how my dad reacted, but she explained that nobody else was awake to see it, and by the time she came back out, they were both gone. When I later mentioned this to my father, who was in his 70s, he insisted that it never happened. He only remembered stories about his dad involving excessive drinking and losing his temper. He had never heard this story before, likely because he chose not to attend my engagement dinner with his side of the family at the last minute. That was when Grandma confided in me, and she also gave me her grandmother's wedding dress, which had just been sitting in a box for years. However, the situation took a chaotic turn when my drunk cousin retold the story. But instead of using our grandfather's name, he swapped in my dad's name. This caused a massive problem within the family this year, and it's been a mess ever since. Story 16. A few years ago, while filling out paperwork for a marriage certificate at the age of 32, I needed information about my birth mother and father. I hadn't spoken to my birth mother since 2011, and my birth father had never been part of my life, so I couldn't just call them for the details. California has a website called the California Birth Index, where I found my father's information easily. However, I couldn't find my mother's. I searched by year and eventually found her, but her last name was not the one I grew up with. It was a Japanese last name. This was odd since it wasn't my grandmother's Mexican maiden name either. It was entirely different. Confused, I called an aunt, and she casually revealed, "Oh yeah, when your mom needed a passport recently, she found out that Grandpa isn't her real dad. We forgot to tell you. Grandma won't talk about it." My whole life I believed I was Japanese because my mother's maiden name and supposed father were Japanese. Finding out that I wasn't Japanese and that the man I thought was my grandfather wasn't actually related to me was a shock. It also made me reflect on my grandmother, who had practically raised me because she didn't want me to end up like my mother, unmarried with 7 kids from 5 different fathers. Ironically, my grandmother had 3 children from 3 different men herself. She used to say, "I don't know how your mother ended up the way she did." Well, it turns out she was just repeating the pattern set by her own life. Pot, meet, kettle. Story 17. My great-grandmother had a rather unexpected side hustle. She used to sell weed to high school kids. They would come over to her house and she would casually pull the weed out of her knitting bag. The kids called her Nana Graham. My grandfather was the one who grew the weed, and my uncle, who was in high school at the time, would spread the word around the school that Nana Graham was the go-to person. Eventually, the police caught wind that weed was being sold from that house, and they arrested my grandfather. Ironically, they never suspected my great-grandmother. She put on quite the show, acting completely shocked when the cops showed up. It was a small town, and nobody ever thought the sweet, tiny old lady could be the mastermind behind a weed operation. She also claimed to be too old to go to church, so the priest would make house calls for her. Truthfully, she just had a crush on him. The whole thing still makes me laugh because she genuinely looked like a stereotypical sweet grandma. Years later, I found out about this story, decades after she passed away. My mom shared it when I was old enough to hear it, casually dropping it like it was nothing. To this day, my grandfather and uncle run a fully legal marijuana business. I think she would be proud to see the family business live on. Story 18. My great-uncle was one of the kindest, most patient, and fun people I knew. He served in the Marines during World War II and the Korean War. While in Korea, he met a girl and fell deeply in love with her. He even wrote a letter to his mother saying he wanted to marry her. However, his mother, my great-grandmother, absolutely forbade it. She said she would disown him and wouldn't tolerate having a gakik daughter-in-law. Back then, it was socially taboo to marry without both parents' consent, so he never married her. He never married anyone after that. He stayed single for the rest of his life, living with his mother until she passed, and then staying in the same house alone. I only found out about this after he died, and it broke my heart. He deserved to be happy and loved, but he gave it all up because of family pressure. It also bothered me that when he was buried at Arlington Cemetery, he didn't receive the 21 gun salute like my grandfather did. They claimed there was a shortage of personnel after 9/11, but it felt like an excuse. He served for over 20 years, and I believe he deserved that honor. I still think about organizing a group of 7 people with guns to give him the salute he never got. Story 19. During a period between marriages, my dad reconnected with an old girlfriend who was back in town. Apparently, she and her husband had been trying to have kids and she was on fertility treatments at the time. I'm not sure if my dad knew she was married when they hooked up. A while later, she called my dad and revealed that she was pregnant. She confessed that the kids were his but begged him to never contact her again. It turns out she had triplets. When I found out, I looked them up on social media, and there was no doubt they looked just like us. However, she remained married to the same man, and I'm pretty sure no one else knows the truth. My siblings and I made a pact to never take any DNA tests because we don't want to destroy what seems to be a happy family. We've decided to just let it be. The kids are being raised in a stable environment, and it doesn't feel right to disrupt their lives with the truth. Story 20. On my mother's side of the family, there were 8 siblings. The eldest, Irma, had a child with a man named Eduardo. My grandmother didn't approve of him because he was a musician, and in Bolivia at that time, musicians were seen as lowly people. Tragically, Irma died within a year of giving birth to her daughter Elsa. To keep Elsa from ever knowing her father, my grandmother and the rest of the family decided to tell her that she was one of the siblings, rather than the daughter of Irma. I always knew Elsa as my aunt, and all my other aunts treated her as their sister, even though she was really my cousin and their niece. One summer, while visiting family in La Paz, Elsa's father, Eduardo, reached out to her. The drama that unfolded was intense. Elsa discovered that she had been lied to her entire life and was understandably furious. My parents, my brother, and I accompanied her to Cochabamba to meet Eduardo for the first time. To our surprise, Eduardo was actually a founding member of a famous Bolivian band called Los Tigres, and his house even had a recording studio. He drove us around the city in the back of his VW minibus that had a truck bed. Eduardo turned out to be a genuinely great guy, ironically enough. Eventually, Elsa forgave the rest of the family, and they still act like sisters, just as they always did. I still call her Tia. That summer was unforgettable, full of revelations and a lot of emotional highs and lows. Story 21. My parents have a 19-year age gap. Growing up, I always assumed there was some kind of power dynamic involved since my dad was 40 and my mom was just 21 when they got together. One day in high school, my dad was on my case about something stupid I had done, and he made a snide comment about bringing any girlfriends home from college since he likes them young. He called my mom in to set the record straight. It turns out the reality was quite different. After he initially told her he wasn't looking for wife number 3 and would find an adult if he was, my mom kept showing up at his parties and usual hangouts. She was persistent, and he never actually took her up on her offer to leave if he wanted her gone. Before long, they were taking pregnant honeymoon photos. They're an odd couple for sure, but 40-plus years later, they're still together, so I guess it worked out for them. Cheers to them for defying the odds. Story 22. My uncle was a genuinely nice guy, well loved by everyone. He had the same girlfriend since high school, and the whole family adored her. They couldn't wait to see them get married. However, they had a spat and broke up, although nobody thought it would last. During their break, my uncle had a one-night stand with another woman and ended up getting her pregnant. The whole family was devastated, not because of the pregnancy itself, but because they absolutely hated the baby's mother. Being strict French Catholics, the family practically forced my uncle to marry her, despite the fact that she was a mean-spirited, conniving person. The marriage was rough, mostly because of her toxic behavior. Growing up, I just thought of her as the mean aunt, not knowing the story behind it. Looking back, I can see how religion and family pressure trapped him into a life he never really wanted. It's sad to think how different things could have been if he had been allowed to choose his own path. Story 23. When I was 19, I worked as a hairdresser and had been cutting the hair of the same guy for about a year. One day, one of my coworkers casually mentioned, "Do you really not know that's your half-brother?" I was floored. It made sense, though. He did resemble my full brother, just not enough for me to connect the dots. It turns out that my dad had 4 other kids from a previous marriage that I knew nothing about. One day, the guy whose hair I had been cutting showed up at our house with another guy who looked exactly like my father, just younger. It was my dad's son, his namesake. My mind was blown. The brother whose hair I'd been cutting knew all along, but never said anything because he didn't want it to be awkward. He was really sweet about it and always tipped me well, which makes sense now. I always felt bad for those kids once I knew the truth. Dad was a bit closed off and probably on the spectrum. He tried to interact with them when they visited, but he didn't really know how. My mom made it worse by giving him hell for weeks afterward, so I guess they stopped coming around. I think they probably came more often when I was younger, but I was in school and missed it. Meanwhile, I got the best version of my dad, stable, present, and financially secure. Near the end of his life, he admitted to regretting letting my mom control him and push his other kids away. It's hard to understand how they kept 4 siblings from me, but I loved my dad regardless. The brother whose hair I cut kept coming to me until I moved away. We never talked about it, but it felt like we shared a quiet, unspoken agreement to just let it be. He was a good guy. If there's one takeaway from all this, it's that if you've got extra kids, let them know about each other. Seriously. Story 24. Growing up, my dad had this old, worn-out t-shirt that said "Weekend" on it. My brother and I have such strong memories of it because he wore it all the time. Finally, in my mid-20s, my parents told us the story behind it. When my mom was 9 months pregnant with me and my brother was 2, they got pulled over by the cops. Mom had a block of pot on her lap. The cops let her off because she was pregnant. But my dad got weekends in jail. The shirt was a joke from my mom, marking that odd chapter of their lives. My mom and her sister also had another run-in with the law before having kids. They were high and called the cops, freaking out because there was a bear in their backyard. They panicked again right after, realizing that calling the cops would lead them straight to their pot field where the bear was trampling around. They had to call the police back and tell them not to come after all. Story 25. During World War II, my grandfather was stationed in the Netherlands and fell in love with a local woman. They had a child together, but her parents wouldn't allow her to move to Canada with him. After a couple of years, they told him the baby had died so he would stop trying to take them away. He didn't find out that the child was still alive until he returned to the Netherlands for the 50th anniversary of the liberation. Not long after, he passed away without telling anyone in the family. About 6 years ago, while researching my genealogy, I stumbled across my grandfather's name on a Dutch family tree, along with one of my uncles. I reached out, curious, and eventually got a response that left me stunned. "We have been looking for you for so long." I learned that I had an entire branch of Dutch family that had been trying to reconnect for years. I traveled to meet them, and it was amazing. My grandfather's Dutch love had been part of the resistance, and they had photos and artifacts that were mind-blowing. They also showed me a letter my grandfather had sent after his trip to the Netherlands, which included photos of me as a small child. Knowing that my grandfather had chosen to share that part of his life with them meant the world to me. It felt like he was vouching for me from beyond the grave. The reconnection has been a beautiful, unexpected gift. Story 26. Back in 2001, when I was in my early 20s, my dad received a letter from the UK. It contained a series of questions like, "Is your name X? Were you in the Navy? Did you used to play soccer? Do you live in X?" On their own, these were pretty generic questions, but together they perfectly described my dad from a few decades earlier. The letter was handwritten and came from a name he didn't recognize. He showed me the letter, and I bluntly asked if he had been messing around back in the day. He insisted he hadn't. I told him it looked a lot like someone was fishing for child support or maybe some inheritance. Eventually, he replied to the letter, confirming his identity. A few months later, he received another letter, this time from a name he did recognize, his ex-girlfriend from nearly 30 years ago. They had dated for a few months before she left Australia to return to the UK. Unbeknownst to him, she found out she was pregnant during the boat ride back. She raised their son on her own, never dating anyone else, and gave him my dad's surname. The person who had tracked my dad down was the son's cousin, who worked at a place that had access to details on will beneficiaries. After my dad's mom passed away, his name showed up on a registry, which is how they found him. And that's how I found out in my 20s that I had an older brother. Story 27. My dad had a pretty wild youth. From ages 12 to 18, he experimented with a lot of hippie drugs, weed, psychedelics, you name it. The most shocking thing I found out was from my cousin, who told me that dad had once given LSD to his younger sister without her knowing. She would have been around 11 or 12, maybe 15 at most. This information was mind-blowing to me because my dad has always been the straight-edge, responsible type. I could never imagine him doing something like that. He became a dad at 20, and that seemed to snap him into being a responsible adult overnight. Looking back, I can see how his rough upbringing might have contributed to his choices. He grew up with a manipulative single mom, and his dad abandoned the family for a much younger woman. I guess it makes sense that he sought escape through drugs at such a young age. Still, dosing his sister with LSD is something I can't quite wrap my head around. Thankfully, his sister turned out fine, and they have a good relationship now. Ironically, despite Dad raising us to be responsible and anti-drug, both my brother and I ended up experimenting with drugs, especially psychedelics. I use cannabis daily to manage chronic pain and have benefited from psilocybin and ketamine for mental health treatment. My brother has tried almost every drug out there, but has calmed down now that he's a father. My dad knows about our drug use, and while he doesn't approve, he just urges us to be safe. Genetics are wild. Story 28. I grew up believing that my sister was my full sibling. She was the oldest, and I was the youngest, with two brothers in between. There's an 11-year age gap between us, and both of my brothers and I share the same parents. It wasn't until I was in my mid-20s that I discovered she was actually my half-sister. My sister was from my mom's first marriage, which I didn't know about either. My dad had adopted her officially when she was around 4 or 5 years old, and he always treated her as his own. The rest of the family knew, but no one ever told me. When my parents split during my teenage years, my sister started pulling away from Dad. By that point, she was in her mid-20s, and it was only when I overheard her talking about how she thought she'd found her biological dad that I learned the truth. After she reconnected with her real father, she distanced herself from our family completely. Dad, who had raised her like his own daughter, hasn't seen her for nearly 20 years. Now that he's struggling with dementia, he still constantly asks about her, wondering why she doesn't visit. It's heartbreaking to see him still love her so much, even though she's been gone from his life for so long. I haven't seen her in 15 years, and every time Dad brings her up, it breaks my heart. Story 29. Growing up, my grandfather was the kindest, most gentle man I knew. He was always loving and sweet to me, and I never thought twice about it. One day when I was a teenager, I was sitting in the back seat of their station wagon when I overheard him whisper something to my grandmother that included the N-word. She just waved him off with an, "Oh, Tom." I convinced myself I must have misheard. Years later, when he passed away, we gathered for his funeral. As we were standing around, drinking punch and reminiscing, about 8 or 9 old white men walked in, marching 2 by 2. They approached his open casket, placed some sort of wreath or sash on him, and left as quickly as they had come. One of them said, "He was a good one," loud enough for me to hear clearly. Right after they left, my uncle gathered the wreath and sash and threw them in the trash outside. Everyone else acted as if those men were ghosts, like nothing had happened. I was confused since I hadn't grown up in the same town as my grandparents and had no idea what was going on. Later, my uncle told me that my grandfather had been some kind of dragon in the KKK, but nobody in the family ever talks about it. My mother has never acknowledged it with me, even though this happened more than 20 years ago. Story 30. When I was 16, I found a Word document on the family computer that changed everything. It was a letter my mom had written to Rod Stewart for some reason, where she confessed to having a baby in high school. Apparently, my family had sent her away to a home for unwed mothers, and she never graduated high school because of it, which I always knew, but not the reason why. I confronted her about it, and she made me swear to keep it a secret. That was 21 years ago. She's since passed away, and while my sibling and I were going through her things, I searched everywhere for proof of the pregnancy or adoption. Eventually, I found official paperwork indicating a closed adoption that took place in 1967 in the United States. We're Canadian. I also discovered the baby's name, my sibling's middle name, and letters from my grandparents to my mom during her time at the home. My sibling still has no idea. And since it was a closed adoption, it's likely that my half-sibling, who is 20 years older than me, doesn't know about us either. I'm still baffled by the whole thing, and I really can't understand why my mom thought Rod Stewart needed to know about it. Story 31. When I was working at a group home for disabled adults, I had been there about a year when I made a shocking discovery. One of the residents was my relative. It turned out that one of my great aunts had gotten pregnant as a teenager back in the 1950s. The baby was born with severe disabilities, and as was common at the time, the child was given up to the state. She lived in a state-run hospital until it closed down, after which the remaining residents were relocated to adult care homes across the state. Once I learned the truth, the resemblance became obvious. It was unsettling because my aunt, who became a lifelong nurse, was always vocal about being pro-life. I had admired her for years. She was single, independent, worked as a travel nurse, and always had the coolest car. After learning this secret, my perception of her changed completely. I get that a teenage pregnancy in the 50s would have been traumatic, and that giving up a disabled baby might have felt like the only option. But to never send a birthday card, a letter, or even a little money, especially when it was so desperately needed, just seemed heartless. I still struggle to reconcile the woman I thought I knew with the reality of what she did. Story 32. Before my cousin's wedding, we stopped by my grandparents' grave to pay our respects. Out of nowhere, my aunt decided to drop a bombshell of family lore. She explained that after our grandma died, our grandpa started dating another woman. They got married just a month or so after meeting. After the marriage, this new step-grandma managed to get his will signed in her name. Not long after that, our grandpa died of a heart attack. My aunt said that they suspected foul play but couldn't prove it. The step-grandma threatened that if they demanded a full autopsy, she would bury him next to her instead of our grandma. Since my grandpa was a heavy smoker, it was easy to attribute the heart attack to stress or cigarettes, but my family has always wondered if it was more than that. Years later, I asked my mom what the woman's name was. She just told me that the step-grandma is still alive, but I didn't need to know her name because she keeps checking the obituaries in her hometown, hoping to see that the bitch has died. To top it off, she's also the reason why my brother, my cousins, and I never got the college funds our grandparents had saved for us. Story 33. I'm 49 years old, and I just found out about this last year. I always knew my grandpa was a recovering alcoholic, but I recently learned that he was also addicted to morphine back in the 1960s. It started when he had a bad stomach ulcer. The standard treatment back then was stomach surgery, which was as awful as it sounds. To manage the post-surgery pain, he was given morphine, and it didn't take long for him to become dependent on it. His addiction grew to the point where he played the prescription game with multiple doctors to maintain his supply. Nobody realized he was injecting morphine until someone found his stash hidden in the garage. He eventually went to rehab, got clean from morphine, and then swapped one addiction for another: alcohol. After battling that for years, he finally got completely sober. I still don't know why the family kept this secret. In my opinion, it makes his story even more impressive. The man fought off two major addictions in his life and came out sober. Knowing about his morphine struggle makes me prouder of him than ever. Story 34. There was always a strange rumor circulating in my family that my grandmother wasn't who she thought she was. My great-aunt openly disliked her, and most of the family kept her at arm's length. The rumor was that my grandmother wasn't biologically related to the family at all, and that she was actually won in a poker game as a baby. A few years ago, my uncle got really into genealogy and decided to do some DNA testing with 23andMe. He expected to find matches with the cousins related to my grandmother, but found none. Instead, he started getting matches with a bunch of other people from the same area. He eventually reached out to one of these distant matches, and they had a family story of their own. Apparently, during the Great Depression, one of their ancestors had a serious gambling problem. During a poker game, in a desperate attempt to bluff, he put his newborn daughter into the pot, assuming the other guy would fold. Except the other guy didn't fold. He won the hand, and along with it, my grandmother. It turns out the story was true, and my grandmother really was won in a poker game. It's wild to think that one reckless bet changed the entire trajectory of our family. Story 35. My great-grandfather always told everyone that he was an orphan who immigrated to the U.S. by himself around 1895. Years later, I got curious and looked up our distinctive last name on the internet. I found a court case involving my great-grandfather from the Midwest that took place in 1890, and he had argued it all the way to the state's Supreme Court. Turns out he actually moved to the U.S. as a child around 1880. At 19, he was working on a farm and got caught having a relationship with the farmer's daughter, who he believed was of age. Apparently she wasn't, and they had been secretly seeing each other all summer. When her father found out, he pressed charges, and my great-grandfather ended up in jail after a coerced confession. His lawyer argued that for a crime like this, they needed to specify a date and approximate time of the offense. A vague confession about something happening sometime in July wasn't enough. They kept appealing, and eventually he won the case. My snooty aunt was horrified to learn that her grandfather spent 5 years in the state penitentiary. Story 36. I found out that both my father and his sister were actually adopted from two extremely poor families. This revelation messed me up for a while because it put so many years of my life into perspective. For as long as I could remember, my relatives had mocked me for my physical appearance and treated me like an outcast, especially pointing out how little I resembled my beloved grandmother. As it turns out, they were trying to make her hate me because they wanted all her assets and money for themselves. When I learned the truth about my dad being adopted, I confronted them and told them to stay out of my life. To everyone's surprise, when my grandmother passed away, she left everything to me. I had been the only one who took care of her for a decade while she suffered from severe dementia. At the will reading, those same relatives laughed at me for crying while gleefully anticipating their supposed inheritance. Seeing their faces when the attorney announced that everything was mine was an unforgettable moment. Story 37. I was the oops baby in the family. My sister and brother from my mom's first marriage are 19 and 15 years older than me. My mom was 37 when I was born, and my dad, her second husband, was 47. Dad pretty much raised my siblings from toddlers and was an amazing father to us all. Since 2000, I've been doing family research on Ancestry, and in 2008, I discovered something surprising. Secret 1. My brother had a son with his girlfriend when he was 18 in the 80s and gave him up for adoption. I found my half-nephew on MySpace back then, and he looked just like my brother. I never reached out because I didn't feel it was my place, but I was glad to see that he seemed happy and well-raised. In 2011, just before my mom passed away, she revealed, Secret 2. My dad used his brother's name and birth date to join the military at age 16 in 1950. While stationed in England in 1960 to 61, before meeting my mom, he had twin boys with a woman there. He couldn't bring them to the States because she was sick, and he couldn't afford it. In 2020, the day after my dad died, my aunt and I made another discovery. Secret 3. My dad was stationed in Louisiana in 1957 before going to England. He married a woman there and had 2 sons. He used his brother's name and birth date for the marriage as well, maintaining the lie. One of those sons has since passed, while the other is alive but has serious issues with alcohol and drugs. I spoke to their sister, who was 3 when my dad married their mom, and she described my dad as a violent, angry alcoholic. She asked me not to contact her brother since he wasn't mentally well, and I respected her wishes. I don't know if my mom ever knew about this part of my dad's past, and I wish I could ask her. Story 38. Before my mother passed away, she was involved in a court case that required her medical records, so she had a printed copy for her own use. After she died, I was sorting through her personal belongings and felt that most of the medical information should be returned to her doctor for proper disposal. However, I decided to keep the letters about her recent cancer treatment, just in case. As I was going through the documents, I came across something unexpected. A child protection social worker's assessment and follow-up report concerning me from when I was 5 months old. According to the report, my mother had become frustrated because I would cry every time she left the room, so she hit me. The social worker documented that my mother did it because she was worried I would turn out like her brother, who was described as hyperactive and difficult as a child. The report also noted that my father was essentially useless in the situation. My mother had to have it explained to her that it was normal for babies at that developmental stage to cry when their mothers weren't in sight, and that it didn't mean I was destined for a life of social deviancy. It's not the most horrific thing to read, but I still can't wrap my head around the logic. I can't believe that's how she thought to address the situation, or that child protection just left us to fend for ourselves after that. Story 39. My grandma on my dad's side was Scottish, or so we always thought. She supposedly sailed to the U.S. when she was 14 and was adopted by the family we had always known as hers. When I did a DNA test, I discovered I was about 35% Scottish. My mom also did the same brand of test and showed almost no Scottish ancestry, so that meant my dad must have a lot. However, when I started looking into my family tree, things didn't add up. I found all of my grandparents' ancestors on both sides, but neither my grandma's nor grandpa's family had any significant Scottish ancestry. Puzzled, I dug deeper and found census records listing my grandma with her supposed parents and siblings. Oddly, her age was off by 2 years, and she had a different first name. A few years later, another census listed her with the correct information. I also found a passenger manifest from a ship coming into Boston with her correct name and birth date. The strangest discovery was that there were no vital records for her birth at all. But I did find a birth record for another little girl with the same first name, the correct parents, and the same birth year listed in the earlier census. The best I can piece together is that the biological youngest daughter of that family must have passed away between the ages of 8 and 12, and they somehow took my grandma in, likely because of the similar name and age. Maybe they kept it quiet because my grandma never talked, and in return, she got a family. My dad doesn't believe it, but my mom always thought it was odd that grandma was so fair, with strawberry blonde hair, blue eyes, and freckles, while the rest of the family had dark hair, brown eyes, and no freckles. Plus, although grandma claimed they had lived in Tennessee for years, she never had an accent, unlike the other siblings who still had a trace of one. It's strange to think that the person we knew as our grandma may have been someone completely different from what we believed. Story 40. On my mother's side of the family, my great-great-grandfather was famously known for supposedly carving a very famous statue. It was a massive point of pride for my mom and all my aunts and uncles, to the extent that they each have replicas of this particular statue displayed in their homes. Inspired by this legacy, I decided to do a history report on the statue during college, thinking it would be a great way to learn more about our family's heritage. Well, things took an unexpected turn. It turns out that the statue was actually made by a very prominent sculptor of the time, and there were meticulous records kept of all the artisans who worked on the project. My great-great-grandfather's name wasn't anywhere on that list. Not only did he not design it, but there was no record of him working on it at all. When I told my aunt about my discovery, she had a full-blown meltdown. She insisted that the historical records were incorrect and that the family had proof, though those supposed records had conveniently been lost. While I admit that there's a slim chance he may have done some minor work on the statue at some point, it's far more likely that he made up the story, assuming no one would ever be able to fact-check it back in a pre-internet world. After seeing how badly my aunt took the news, I decided to drop the subject and only shared it with my siblings. I figured it was better to let the rest of the family continue believing the story rather than shattering their pride. I'll just make sure to set the record straight with my own kids in the future. Story 41. In my mid-20s, I found out that my mom had a baby at 18 and gave him up for adoption. Years later, when I was 30, I decided I wanted to find him, so I took an ancestry DNA test. When I mentioned it to one of my aunts, she reacted strongly and told me not to go digging into things that weren't my business. I didn't listen and went ahead with the test. My brother wasn't on the site, but I did match with a woman who seemed like she could be my grandmother. I reached out, and she turned out to be my biological grandmother, my dad's mom. We started exchanging emails, sharing photos, and getting to know each other. One day, she told me something difficult to hear. In her 20s, she married a man who turned out to be abusive and secretly gay. He was also inappropriate with their son, my dad. When the man left, she didn't want to be a single mother, so she spoke to her in-laws, who agreed to adopt her son as their own. My dad was then raised by his grandparents, whom I had always known as Grandma and Grandpa. Growing up, I thought Uncle Jay was just my dad's brother, but there were always weird interactions between them. Eventually, I learned that Uncle Jay was actually my dad's biological father, the abusive man. When my dad was pressured into reconciling with him by his sister, he finally cut ties with the family. 6 months after my DNA test, I got a message on Facebook from a man who matched as my full sibling. My mom had always wondered if the baby she gave up was my dad's or someone else's. I immediately called my sister, and we cried together. I went to my parents' house and shared the news. They were thrilled to have found our brother. I also told my dad that I had been in contact with his mother and that I knew about Uncle Jay. Dad already knew about his parentage and brushed it off. He had never really dealt with the trauma from his childhood. Now, I see my brother regularly. He lives about an hour away and has a wife and daughter, so I became an instant aunt. My biological grandmother and I stayed in touch for a couple of years, and she was so happy when I told her I was pregnant. Sadly, she passed away shortly after my daughter was born, and I never got to meet her in person since she lived several states away. As for Uncle Jay, I don't have any contact with him and don't plan to. I don't even know where he lives, but I occasionally check for his obituary once or twice a year. I'm grateful for reconnecting with my brother and my biological grandmother, but some parts of the past are better left buried. Story 42. My aunt had a child as a teenager and gave the baby up for adoption. It wasn't all that shocking since she had another child as a teen as well. What was surprising was that years later, that child showed up at her doorstep as an adult, hoping to meet her birth mother. Instead of welcoming this person, my aunt completely refused to acknowledge them. She turned them away, saying she couldn't risk her other kids or her current husband finding out. She's built her life around being a pious, church-going lady and didn't want to tarnish her reputation. The thing is, my aunt is generally a terrible person who hides behind a facade of righteousness. After our last grandparent on that side of the family passed away, I made a post about this situation on the family history website. If she had been a decent human being, I might have kept her secret, but sometimes the truth needs to come out. Story 43. My dad left when I was 2.5, and my little brother was 1. My whole life, my mom drilled into us that men were scum and that our dad was the worst of them all for abandoning us. Years later, while living in another city, I found my dad's name in the phone book. Being young and curious, I called the number. A deep voice answered, "Hello?" I introduced myself and said I thought he might be my dad. He responded, "Well, I do have sons with those names." We arranged to meet up. During lunch, after some awkward small talk, I asked him why he left. He hesitated, then finally just said, "Ah, what the hell? Your little brother isn't mine." Turns out my dad never really wanted to marry my mom, mostly because he was still hurt from catching his previous wife in bed with his best friend. He and my mom dated for a few years before she finally convinced him to marry her. After I was born, my little brother came along. Platinum blonde hair and bright blue eyes, despite both my parents having brown hair and brown eyes. My dad got suspicious and secretly did a DNA test, which confirmed his doubts. The child wasn't his, so he left. When I confronted my mom about it, she was furious. Once she calmed down, my brother asked who his real dad was. It turned out to be the same best friend my dad had caught with his first wife. To make it even worse, this guy had been secretly dating my mom's twin sister, my aunt at the time, cheating on her with my mom. My entire life, I had been manipulated into believing my dad was the bad guy, when in reality, my mom was the one who caused the chaos. It was shocking and painful to learn the truth. Story 44. My aunt is the oldest of 8 siblings and has always been there for everyone. I always thought it was because she was just that kind-hearted, but it turns out it's rooted in guilt. When she was around 18, my youngest uncle was still a baby. One day, the police contacted her and asked her to come to the morgue. My grandma could barely read, so my aunt was the one in charge. They had found my grandpa after he'd been killed in a fight. My aunt knew it was him, but didn't claim the body because that would have meant paying for the funeral, which they couldn't afford. She made the heartbreaking decision to walk away, leaving him unclaimed. She never told anyone, not her mom, not her siblings. My grandma spent the rest of her life waiting for her husband to come back, never remarrying. My dad wrote poems about how his father abandoned them. The entire family grew up believing that their dad had just left, and it caused a lot of unresolved pain. We only found out because one night, about 40 years later, my aunt got drunk and confided in my sister. My sister told me, but we never shared the secret with the rest of the family. Now that my grandma has passed, I still don't know whether to reveal the truth or let them hold on to the belief that he just left. Sometimes, the truth feels more painful than the story they created to cope. Story 45. I found out just a few years before my grandma passed away that my dad's oldest sister is actually his half-sister. My grandma had a daughter before she got together with my grandpa, and instead of making a big deal out of it, my grandpa chose to raise her as his own. This was back in the late 40s and early 50s, when being a single mom was heavily stigmatized. In hindsight, it makes sense because my oldest aunt has slightly different features and eye color compared to the rest of us. I'm not sure if my dad and his siblings knew the truth, but no one ever made it a big issue. I only found out in my late 20s when my cousin casually mentioned it, and my grandma confirmed it. Finding out about this made me respect my grandpa so much more. I never got to meet him. He passed away several years before I was born. Everything I know about him comes from stories and old photos. It really says something about his character to step up and marry a single mom during a time when that wasn't the norm. He and my grandma stayed married until his death, and I think it's incredibly sweet. Story 46. This isn't so much a secret as it is some heavy family history. My great-grandpa fought in World War I for Austro-Hungary. During World War II, he was too old for frontline duty, so the Nazis made him round up people instead. He passed away before I was born, but my dad used to ask him tons of questions about the war. Turns out my great-grandpa was a total badass during World War I, fighting somewhere in Romania. After the wars, he bought a P-08 Nazi pistol and an M95 rifle from returning soldiers in exchange for a loaf of bread and some ham. These weapons still sit in our family's gun safe, and it's mind-blowing to me that we have pieces of history like that. The pistol is in great condition, though it had a bullet hole in the handle when we got it. We replaced the grip plate and magazine, took it to a gunsmith, and it still shoots perfectly. The M95, on the other hand, is pretty beat up. I can't make out the caliber stamped into the barrel, and I'm worried it might explode if we try to fire it. Interestingly, parts of the cow fence on the family farm are still held together by barbed wire from World War II. It's surreal to think that bits of both world wars still linger around our home and land. Story 47. My uncle married a German woman he met in Chicago in the early 1950s. She had fled Berlin with her mother after World War II. Her mother had been a maid in Heinrich Himmler's house. Whenever we visited them, they only spoke German, which we found kind of rude at the time. They even had a German shepherd named Wolfie. My uncle became completely fluent in German over the years. Their household was very German-centric. They never spoke about World War II, and the German grandmother never learned a single word of English. My uncle's daughters were tall, blonde, and very Aryan-looking. My American side of the family also had German ancestry, but they were extremely patriotic and didn't really discuss their heritage. My grandmother never really liked her German daughter-in-law. I only found out about the whole Nazi connection around the time my grandmother passed away. It struck me as odd that no one had ever discussed it before. I've visited Berlin twice since then, and I often think about how they must have lived there during the war. I wish I had known about their history earlier. I would have loved to ask them more about their lives in Germany, but I doubt they would have shared much anyway. Story 48. About 100 years ago, Ireland went through a bloody war of independence, followed by a civil war. Like many Irish families, we were raised on stories of the rebels and the martyrs who fought against the empire. Our family was no different. During the lockdown, I decided to dig into my family history using Ancestry. I paid for a month's subscription and started gathering dates and information from relatives. Surprisingly, 2 of my dad's siblings called me almost immediately, telling me not to bother because it had already been done. They seemed strangely insistent, but since I'd already paid, I kept going. What I found was a shock. It turns out we weren't always a farming family. My great-grandfather on my dad's side had been in the Royal Irish Constabulary, RIC, the very force that we vilified in our family songs, seen as the violent arm of the British Empire. Apparently, he joined the RIC at a young age because, as a late son with no land or wealth to inherit, it was one of the few options available. However, he left as soon as political tensions escalated, marrying into some land and leaving the force by age 25. Still, the fact that he had once been part of the RIC is a closely guarded secret on my dad's side of the family. Story 49. My grandfather was a serial entrepreneur, running an ambulance service, a mercantile store, a large horse ranch, and a farm. Family lore always said he died young of natural causes. He was well regarded in the community and one of the area's largest employers. Around the age of 50, he commissioned a custom-built house on the edge of town, complete with verandas, vineyard views, modern amenities, a riding stable, and a beautiful lake. After moving his family into this luxurious new home, he went out onto the sun porch one morning, took a double-barreled shotgun, and shot himself through the head, scattering his brains all over the custom stained glass windows. The local paper reported it as an accident, and both the sheriff and coroner filed it as an accidental discharge. The church held a grand funeral, describing it as a horrible accident, and hundreds attended. Decades later, while researching family history, I found a newspaper clipping from a nearby town where he also owned a grain silo. That paper wrote about his Suix, detailing his episodes of depression and even quoting an eyewitness farmhand who discovered the body.